You're listening to Masonry Principles, your guide to building better buildings, with hosts Amanda Badian and Phil Leden. Hi, well, thanks for joining us on Masonry Principles. Today we have Jason Thompson. He is the Vice President of Engineering with the National Concrete Masonry Association, also known as NCMA. We've got Phil here, and our topic of today will be resiliency. I think you guys are in for a treat, and I'm going to let Phil take over from here.
Thanks a lot, Amanda. I thought this would be a real good one to start with because I think, when we think about history, masonry is really one, if not the only structural system that kind of has that survivability behind it, where you look at a lot of these historic buildings, especially throughout the Middle East, and masonry has just kind of proven itself over the course of time. And so where I wanted to kind of steer today's episode and talking with Jason is kind of about what constitutes building resiliency. And if you read through some of the literature, a lot of it's really defined by safety and durability. But unfortunately, a lot of these aren't addressed in our current building codes. And so, Jason, I guess, where do you see our industry currently in terms of resiliency in the building codes?
Well, I think you hit kind of the primary talking point from the masonry perspective on the head, Phil, relative to masonry and its contributions to resiliency. It's a proven material. It's been around for forever. One of the things that I think that we're really kind of struggling with as a society is how do we integrate proven materials like masonry into that bigger spectrum of what we're trying to accomplish in terms of a resilient construction, resilient community. So for example, one of the things that's being debated right now isn't just, what does it mean to be resilient, but what aspects do you need to accomplish to be resilient, and how far of a swath do you actually need to cast in order to be able to kind of consider your house, your community, your city, your county, whatever jurisdictional aspect that you're looking at is resilient. We know that we can build a very robust, resilient masonry structure. But if that structure is within a community that is devastated by some sort of a natural event, wildfire, hurricane, tornado, what have you, then we're struggling with how to rebound as a community, right? So we have to have our stores and our gas stations and our infrastructure, utilities, and everything else that feeds those masonry structures. So one of the things that is that challenging point is we know how to do things. We don't necessarily know how to integrate them across sort of that broad perspective. And I think, as we trickle into the building code aspect of things, that's one of the things that they're really sort of struggling with is how do we make sure that our buildings, we know how to build resilient buildings, but how do we ensure that we're not just looking at one aspect or one piece of the overall resiliency pie, if you would. And that's frankly been one of the arguments as to why to keep out more resilient aspects within the building codes is it is a kind of this holistic concept that we need to look at from not just our infrastructure and our buildings, but that whole social economic perspective. And so you do have, frankly, there are some within the AEC community, the construction industry that want to keep the building codes at their minimums, and that's technically what they're defined as is now is they are minimum requirements for the design and construction of our buildings. And we know that there's simple things that we can be doing that are not very cost prohibitive that we can integrate into building codes that make our buildings a much more integral part of that whole resiliency pie.
Yeah, and I think building codes have historically focused on the safety aspect. I think when you think about fires, buildings are designed to get occupants out during a fire event. However, there's nothing saying that building is going to be standing after the fire event. And so the building codes, I think, have historically kind of moved more towards that minimum requirements for life safety, like what you're talking about, Jason, where I think masonry has that unique ability to not only provide that safety that we can get occupants out of a building, but it does have that durability aspect where that building's still going to be there after an event like that.
Absolutely. And so that is one of the big trends that started within the building codes probably about 3 decades ago, where they've been shifting off of these prescriptive objectives. So if you wanted to have a fire safe building, you built it, and the code mandated that you build it out of non-combustible construction. And what we have in building codes today is performance objectives. And so now it says you got to have a 1 hour rated wall or 2 hour rated assembly. And those can be built out of anything. I mean, you can have a combustible 2 hour rated assembly that's used in a lot of different applications. And so what we've really kind of done is whittle away at the redundancy, the resilient aspects of our built environment, with that overall objective of we can make things a little bit less expensive to build, uh, and as a result make things a little bit less resilient and a little bit less redundant when we start getting into some of these more extreme events.
And I think, I mean, in terms of those extreme events, I know NCMA has data on it. I've seen information from some of the structural organizations, but I think these extreme events, I mean, they're occurring at a much more regular interval now. We're seeing more of these extreme events. And so, how does that play into kind of our strategy for resilient construction?
Well, I think one of the arguments there is, and again, it gets back to how do we define resiliency within the building code arena, and we can kind of take these small steps, chip away at little things. But if we were to, ask yourself, ask the listeners, do I live in a resilient building? Most would feel that they live in a pretty safe environment, right? But if we look at it through the building codes lens, there's a number of things that the building codes, frankly, just don't address. So things that are fairly simple and benign when we kind of think about it, impact resistance. And so an extreme event could be hailstorms, for example, and that's one of the things that causes some of the most damage out there, at least from an underwriter's or an insurer's perspective. What they're looking at is trying to mitigate some of those payouts after some of these more extreme events. Now, if we did something as simple as putting in minimum impact resistance for our cladding materials, stuff that vinyl siding, for example, wouldn't be able to resist the impact from hail. I think it'd get us a whole lot further down that path, at least in terms of sort of getting the overall mindset pointed in the right direction. Now, in terms of the frequency of some of these events, I do think that some of that is starting to be reflected now in building codes. So we are seeing a number of different committees now that are working on um, addressing issues that frankly were never in building codes before, even if they're somewhat rare events. So things such as tsunamis, they are now part of building code requirements if you're in a tsunami prone region. Tornadoes were introduced. Tornado and shelter design was introduced a number of years ago. And what we're going to be seeing in the next iteration of the building codes is really the requirement that all regions of the country address to some degree or another tornadic wind speeds. And so we are seeing this sort of trickle in under different sort of arguments, whether or not it's, you can make the argument that it's climate change or anything else. But you're right, we are seeing changes in how our structures are being exposed to these different types of environmental extreme events. And as a result, we're adapting to them to some degree through the building codes. Is it fast enough? It's kind of the big question.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, especially in terms of tornadoes, I think I'm excited personally in Michigan about some of the upcoming code provisions because it's interesting with ICC 500 and some of these tornado shelter provisions. It actually has gotten more political in some of these states where it's been written out of our state building code. And so, in terms of tornadoes, some of our states, although they accept that we are in that risk category for tornadoes, we're just not requiring that structures conform to tornadoes. And in many cases, it has to do with bonds for schools, with cost of construction, things like that. But the building code, with its purpose being life safety, it's really good that we are adapting and kind of moving forward and requiring those things.
And it's slow. And unfortunately, what tends to be a real galvanizer from a building code change perspective is unfortunately extreme events. So before we had Joplin, which was horrific and caused a huge amount of damage and deaths. There was no requirement for storm shelters associated with K-12 schools, and that was one of the motivators, one of the genesis behind introducing storm shelters to K-12 schools as a mandate through the building code. And we see those types of events that pop up every so often where, as some extreme event happens, as some devastating event happens, we end up reacting to it in some cases very appropriately through the building code, but in a much more quicker manner. And as a result, I think that the regulator society doesn't necessarily always have the amount of time to react or prepare appropriately. And so I think that's where you do see situations like what you see in Michigan, where they essentially wrote out some of those storm shelter provisions because they weren't prepared. They didn't have it captured in their bonds. They couldn't build new schools and still comply with the building codes if they were to adopt those provisions. And so part of this really kind of leans towards it's an educational aspect of things as well. Why do we need to change the building codes? What's the implication associated with adopting or not adopting some of those requirements that we're trying to achieve with more resilient construction?
Talking about the resiliency, and all I hear is like we put so much pressure, I feel like, on the industry as masonry to figure it out and change the building codes and get things to go. But as far as educating the end user, we as consumers put our trust into the contractors that they're building us, safe buildings, whether it's multi-unit or like the apartment complexes. Like, how can we educate the end user to care a little bit more about the space that they're moving into?
Yeah, so this is always one of those questions that gets down to the dollars and cents of things, right? Can you convince an worth investing $1,000 more in having a structure that's more resilient, or $1,000 more into those granite countertops? And everyone sort of has their own internal mechanisms and motivators for those types of decisions. The way I do look at it is more from a long-term view, if you would. So one of the things that sort of is inherent to resilient construction of any sort is it's a lower cost maintenance building to operate. So whether you're looking at it from simple things in terms of painting or anything else, it's just cheaper to operate those things. And so, that small investment on the front end, there's a number of studies out there that kind of look at the a dollar today is worth $5, $6, $7 in 10 years type of thing, at least in terms of its return on mitigating the disasters associated with some of these extreme events. And so, it does kind of get down to how do you educate some of these owners on some of these things?
Yeah, and it just seems to be like you're hitting your head against the wall because it makes sense. It's like logical to want to invest into a safer building, if you will. But then the dollar and cents come into play, and it's like you're already spending millions of dollars. Like, why don't we just value engineer and you can build a more robust building and a safer building, a more resilient building? It's like they have a block. Not everyone, but most cases, it's just a very difficult conversation.
You're absolutely right. It all really kind of comes down to how do they understand what the return for them is. And unfortunately, some arguments are always going to fall on deaf ears. If you're a developer that's going to unload a property in 14 months or so, it's not something that's going to maximize their bottom line. Where I do see that there's some potential benefits is, and we kind of saw this a little bit 10 years or so ago, where it was society that was driving some of the green building practices, right? So you saw developers investing more in their developments to incorporate some of those more sustainable practices because they could sell it. They could charge more for it at the end. And so I do think that we are seeing a little bit of that turning of the corner happening. People are understanding what the impacts of construction is, not just short term but longer term. And I think we become more educated as a society. There's going to be more demands for more resilient construction.
Yeah, and I know I totally agree. It's just figuring out that perfect recipe of educating society, and like safety doesn't have to be a luxury kind of thing, like everybody should have a safer building, especially when you're sharing walls. That's where I just you don't know your neighbor, you don't know what they're doing on the other side of the wall. And some of these codes they're just so lenient, and it just gets frustrating when you try talking to people, but here we are.
And I think really defining who the end user is from a masonry perspective, we've struggled with, mixed use buildings, with apartments, hotels, those kind of structures. And it really comes down to the end user, the person actually living there, that's going to need to
Right.
demand, that these buildings get built with resiliency in mind. It's not going to be the developer, like you pointed out, Jason, who typically they're looking 12, maybe 18, maybe 24 months into the future. And so there's just not that return on their investment for them to make it more resilient. And so without, I think as a society, us having a good understanding of an acceptable level of risk and really demanding that our buildings are more resilient, I think that's kind of where that powder keg is and where we really need to hit it, where people are going to start demanding these sorts of things out of their codes and out of their structures.
No, I couldn't agree more.
Jason, you had mentioned performance-based design. The codes right now, the way they're set up, you mentioned firewalls for an example of performance-based design. Do you see performance-based design kind of being adopted more holistically across the board? I guess in terms of masonry, structural design, maybe, or in other aspects of building construction.
So long term, I think performance-based design is going to be a much more integral part of everyday kind of common design. Part of the reason for saying that is, when you tackle a project under the performance code or any sort of performance objective, it frankly is a way to sort of rationalize value engineering. And so it's worth the upfront effort to be able to spend a little bit more time on the design side, to be able to save on the construction side of the equation. So even though the overall goal sort of seems admirable, at least in terms of we're trying to achieve certain performance objectives, by and large, some of these performance criteria really kind of actually undermine some of these resiliency objectives by removing some of the redundancies and resilient aspects of materials and assemblies and everything else, because again, it's more than anything else a way to sort of rationalize a value engineering approach.
Yeah, that completely makes sense. With that in mind, I guess there are organizations out there like the U.S. Resiliency Council. Do you see them playing a major role, I guess, in the future? I mean, I know you'd mentioned with kind of the green initiative taking over about 10 years ago, how a lot of end users were demanding buildings be more environmentally conscious. And I think that really took off. But in terms of U.S. Resiliency Council and their rating system, do you see that kind of becoming the norm in the future?
I see bits and pieces of that potentially integrating into our more common everyday design. From a pure building perspective, there's a lot of those programs that already exist out there. So there's a group out there called the Institute for Business and Home Safety, and what they essentially do, they are funded by insurance companies, underwriters, and what they try to do is they try to raise the bar for overall performance. And their objective is obvious. They want to pay less in insurance claims. So what they end up doing, and they have a fantastic research facility down in South Carolina where they really kind of put different structures and systems and materials through the paces of some extreme events, and through that they've established some benchmarks. So a lot of people may be familiar with things like, the Energy Star rating system for residential construction, commercial construction, energy efficiency of our buildings, and they have the similar types of programs that are specific to how do these systems, how do these buildings actually perform, and so they can give some of these ratings. I see that getting a little bit more traction in different areas of the country, programs like that, more so than the U.S. Resiliency Council, which is really kind of looking a little higher level, kind of what we were talking about before in terms of how does this overall resiliency umbrella affect our communities? What's the overall social economic impacts that city councils and mayors and some of those jurisdictional offices would have to take into consideration when they're looking at that full spectrum of resiliency objectives?
That makes complete sense. I've been reading a lot of articles, and it just seems like the cost associated with some of these disasters has just expounded exponentially. And so I think, I mean, a big part of resiliency is thinking ahead about some of those costs that our country does endure as a result of some of these natural disasters.
And I do see some of these programs being, for lack of a better word, sort of forced upon us, in a good way, from the federal side. So when you do have these large scale events, whether it's wildfires or hurricanes or tornadoes or earthquakes or what have you, it's really the federal government that comes in and helps to rebuild after these. And so, one of the things that we have seen, and it really kind of started with legislation for earthquakes, that the federal government said, look, if you want us to be able to help you after a devastating earthquake event, you have to meet these certain benchmarks. You have to meet these certain minimums in terms of your building stock, your infrastructure. And we're starting to see that trickle out into, high wind events and so on and so forth. Flooding is the same kind of thing. Flooding's a big payout. Both in terms of insurance claims as well as federal disaster assistance.
What about comparing the US to maybe our neighbors? How is Canada approaching resiliency? Do you have any feedback on how other countries are handling these issues?
So everyone does have a different philosophy on these, and so if we look at the resiliency question through the lens of the building stock, Europe's a pretty good gold standard, right? So they don't build for the short term. They don't have disposable construction. Young buildings there 400 or 500 years old, and it's just not a philosophy that we've ever really embraced within the U.S. Canada, I would say, is closer, more so to the European model than the U.S. So it's a lot of it's somewhat just performance objectives that are a little bit simpler, but they deal a lot more with addressing corrosion protection for all their metal materials and buildings. So things that we would permit here in the U.S. are not permitted under the Canadian code because they do have a little bit more of that long-term vision in mind with their building stock.
All right, Jason. Well, thanks for all that feedback. And kind of looking ahead, I think we've talked about historically a lot of the challenge we faced with resiliency and talking about masonry and where that fits in. Do you have any feedback on maybe where masonry does fit in with the future with resiliency in mind?
One of the natural attributes of masonry is it is fundamentally inherently resilient. So whether we're looking at it from the perspective of fire resistance, and that could be structure-borne fires, wildfires, flooding, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, all that stuff that kind of comes along with what we try to achieve with resilient building stock, masonry is already there. And so we have building codes that don't necessarily trigger or mandate some of these requirements, but once we get to those places within our building codes as a minimum objective, masonry is already there. So we've essentially kind of positioned, inherently through the material that masonry is, being able to be inherently resilient. And we can do so without compromising some of those needs, those objectives through resiliency. So we can still have beautiful structures that are resilient. We can still have flood-proof structures that are resilient, and they don't have to necessarily cost the same as living at Fort Knox, for example, and to be able to achieve some of those objectives. So we can still achieve what we want to be able to do as society in order to have the types of buildings that we want to live in, that are comfortable to live in, that are sustainable, that are located in some of these higher risk areas of the country, whether it's hurricanes or tornadoes or what have you. And we can still meet the objectives, whatever they end up being defined as. We can meet these objectives for resilient building stock just simply by being masonry.
And I think, I mean, David Biggs kind of alludes to that in some of his articles he's written, where he talks about optimal resiliency, combining resilient materials, resilient systems with redundancy. And I think you absolutely are correct, Jason. I mean, when we look at masonry buildings around the country, I mean, they're inherently redundant. Masonry kind of has proven itself over time as a resilient material, and it leads to kind of those resilient systems. So I think masonry is really nicely suited for the optimal resiliency that people like David Biggs have talked about and others, where kind of like you said, regardless of what the outcome is, or regardless of what the building code mandates, masonry is already a very nice solution because it's already there. We're already designing with that in mind.
And even if we aren't, it's going to give it to us whether we want it or not, right?
Right, right.
So what are the next steps in, like, I know we've got a few good things going on nationally on as far as building codes and a few committees, but like what are some things we should share with everyone as far as the resiliency factor, what the future looks like for it for masonry?
Well, in general, I think some of this is still sort of being shook out in terms of how do we as a society define these resilient objectives. And honestly, one of my big concerns with the effort that's really being debated and argued right now is, what ends up happening when it goes through a committee process and ends up getting watered down. We're all familiar with the terms like greenwashing, right? We can all pretend to be sustainable, but we're really not changing what we're doing. And that is where I think that as a masonry industry, as kind of society, we need to kind of keep our eyes on that horizon where we're not going to accept the greenwashing, or in this case the sustainability washing. We want to achieve some real meaningful objectives through some of these building code requirements.
And as far as educating the consumer, the tenant of the building, if you will, not just the owners of the construction project, what are some things that we can do to make them more aware?
Well, unfortunately, it still comes back to those events that cause loss of life. The Grenfell Towers in England, for example, that's one that highlighted an issue with a certain type of cladding system that shouldn't have been put on a building, frankly. And as a result, they ended up forcing through some changes and going out and retrofitting a number of buildings in there in the UK. And we do the kind of the same thing, unfortunately. We wait for that unfortunate event to happen, then we start to make some of these more substantial changes.
Right. And it's almost like too little, too late. You have to, why do we have to be to the point of where we're losing buildings to make people more aware? Like it drives me crazy sometimes. If just talking to like a regular old person, you should be more aware of the space you're living in. Like understand that you're sharing walls with people. You don't know what your neighbor's doing. And I've been trying to figure it out and brainstorm different ways of making the public more aware. We got into the advertising efforts of just putting out commercials and trying to just do brand awareness in that sense. But I think that there's just a bigger movement that needs to happen as far as educating that end user before the catastrophe happens.
In general, our society's kind of, if it's not broke, don't fix it, which I think
Right.
only tells part of the story. I think people often leave the yet off the end of that. So it's not broke yet. Why fix it? And then when we talk about Europe and things like that, I mean, they just design with such that longevity in mind that their yet is a lot different than our yet here, where, we're going to see things like that happening with our natural disasters.
Yeah, it's just unfortunate, really, 'cause and it's like, and both of you are engineers by trade, and over here, I'm just baffled sometimes of when I'm talking to some of these people in the sense of like, it makes sense to me. How come I can't get it to make sense to you? But I guess once I figure that out, we'll take over the world, won't we?
And it does really kind of start and end with that education of the end user. There's been scenarios, for example, where I've you have friends that have done custom built houses for themselves. So this is something that they're going to invest in, and they want to retire in. So it's a long term, lifetime investment for them. They don't plan on moving till they have to move, type of thing. And frankly, it was, when they go out and they do these things and they get bids, and it ends up being wood frame construction. And part of that is, they're just so locked into that's what I expect to see. It's what the contractors are bringing to them as options. But when they get a little bit of education, when they literally just sit down and talk to you for 5 minutes, and you can say, boy, if, and it's not that much more cost, but you get all these other benefits associated with it. Every single one of them would have said, did say that, that was just a poor choice on their part. If they could, they would go back and make a different decision.
Right. Yeah, and that's just you got to start the conversation while they're in the planning process, like the conception of the idea that they want to do something and try to retrain the brain is really I feel like what we need to achieve. In the sense we're so used to seeing things like Phil and I were talking, you drive around these communities and you see all this construction happening, and some of them just look like matchboxes. Like I was telling Phil, you just throw a cigarette butt on them and they look like they would just catch on fire, but they're meeting the building code. And that's what we're used to seeing. That's what Sally down the street is used to seeing, so they don't think any differently than, well, that's normal. But it's like making them aware of that there are other materials out there that offer an array of benefits, and it's, I guess, banging your head up against the wall to get them to understand. But, I feel like we could go on and on about resiliency, and it's just such a hot topic, and I really liked what you were saying about the greenwashing. Like, I feel like we worship everything but value nothing at the same time as far as a society. Like, everyone's on the sustainability train, whether you're getting rid of straws and plastic bags or you're building however you think sustainability, whatever that means to you in your building. But I feel like we just need to have a different conversation of like making people more aware of what greenwashing is and that it does happen in the construction industry. There's just so many different ways we could go about it.
Well, it still does come down to that baseline education. Whoever that critical link in the decision-making tree is, whether it's the end owner, whether it's the GC on a project, the architect, whoever's kind of making that sort of first push, why are they going with whatever system that they're using? And if they understood truly, the inherent benefits of masonry, then the vast majority of the time their minds would be changed. They would see the light, so to speak.
I'll finish with this. So, how, besides getting in and getting that meeting with the owner, because the owner is the money, and maybe, I mean, best case scenario, you have the owner and you have the architect and you have the engineer all in the same room, right? It's the perfect sales pitch for the perfect people in front of you. But how would you wrap it up in one sentence of why to choose masonry?
I'm thinking, can I use 3 sentences?
Yes, sorry, please. 3 sentences, but, like a short what's your elevator pitch? And you've only got 60 seconds to explain it to these people.
So in terms of what that short elevator pitch would be, in terms of why to choose masonry, I think we kind of hit on one aspect of it or another throughout this whole discussion. It's a proven material. It's beautiful, it's functional. We know that it's got all these inherent attributes, whether it's recognized through code provisions or not. They are there. They are going to be providing those mechanisms and those benefits for the life of the structure. And it's the reason why when we go around the entire globe and look at all the monumental structures that have been built by civilization through the millennia, they're masonry. We don't see a whole lot of wood pyramids out there. There's reasons for that, and it's really kind of driven by the fact that the material performance is fundamentally different.
I'm gonna record that, and I'm just gonna play it in all the meetings I go to.
Good.
There's my elevator pitch. Well, thank you so much, Jason. And I would, if you don't mind, I just want to ask a question so people can understand you a little bit more and the man behind the mic. What are your favorite resources to use when designing or looking into masonry?
So, working for the National Concrete Masonry Association, I'm kind of partial to our tech notes and our software and some of those things. There's a number of things that, in fact, Phil's actually developing a couple cool tools as well that I've even started tinkering around with. The best resource though is everyone here on this podcast, everyone that we sort of interact with. Masonry it's a wide and varied material. And so there's a number of people out there that are frankly just great experts that as a community, we're a masonry community that love to kind of, because they're so passionate about this material, this construction assembly, that they're more than willing to talk with people and offer up their expertise. So my favorite tool is actually the industry. It's one that I do tap into quite a bit. Just kind of developing that network of experts across the entire industry.
Yeah, no, and we've got a great network. Phil and I were talking about it when we were introducing ourselves of just everyone's so eager to give information that more people need to take them up on it. Well, thank you so much. This was our first episode with Masonry Principles, and we have a lot more great conversation to come. We will be posting our episodes the first Wednesday of each month, and we hope you're excited for the content we've got coming for you. Thank you so much, Jason. I hope you have a great day. And Phil, you as well. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Masonry Principles. To continue the conversation, be sure to reach out to us by visiting masonryprinciples.com.